So welcome everybody to our second Australian Educational Podcast Conference. We are so delighted that you are here with us. We are so excited with the program. We've been spending nearly 12 months pulling it together with a variety of beautiful, wonderful, talented, amazing podcasters from a whole heap of different disciplines, backgrounds, experiences, and we're so glad that you're here with us. And we are delighted that Swinburne is hosting, and particularly the School of Social Sciences, Media, Film and Education, and our Adobe Creative Campus as well. So before we go any further, I would just like to acknowledge the country and the lands that we're on, and respectfully acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and the elders past, present and emerging, who are the traditional owners of the land on which Swinburne campuses are located on. They are the traditional lands of which I am currently located on, but I also acknowledge the lands that you may also be located on right now from where you're zooming in from. So our theme for the conference is all about engaging our hearts and minds through audio. And we're asking 4 beautiful questions throughout the conference that many of our presenters are focusing on one or many of them. And we're asking you to think about them as well as you consider the presentations and the different sessions that we have today and tomorrow as well. And we're really looking at how we bridge our hearts and minds through podcasting, how we connect with our own and each other's hearts and minds through audio and the power of audio. And we're thinking about what does this mean for learning and teaching, but what does it also mean for research and research engagement as well? So we are encouraging you to tweet. We have a hashtag of AusEdPodCon, so you're more than welcome to live tweet. But for those who are presenting, every now and then there may be something that you shared that you don't wish to have tweeted. So please feel free to say non-tweeting at this moment. We are recording each session as well, and they will be disseminated because some people have registered and they can't make it because of the different time zones. But it's also a wonderful record of our community, of supporting those who wish to engage with podcasting for learning and teaching, but also for research purposes as well. So we want the conference to, and the ideas to live on beyond today. If you're not presenting or participating in a Q&A at the time, just ask for you to make sure that your microphone's off. And we are very much about setting up a community here, and that is underpinned by mutual respect. We're engaging in conversation and very much embrace different perspectives, but we also just want to make sure that we're mutually respectful in how we present that and acknowledging that not everyone will agree with everybody at the same time. So we are encouraging using the chat throughout. So not only just to ask questions, but to also make comments about what you're hearing, ideas, how you make connections. So we've kind of got the 2 experiences occurring at the same time in terms of what we're listening to, but also our beautiful community that can really form throughout the presentations in the chat as well. And we have the delightful Corey, Dylan and Peter here, or who will be helping us in the chat as well. So if at any stage you feel uncomfortable or you want to ask a question one-on-one, please reach out to them in the chat as well. They're here to support you. So as you would have discovered when you registered, we've got a wonderful site where we have utilised Adobe Portfolio to literally create a portfolio for this conference. And every presenter from our keynotes right through to our think-ins is represented here, both in text but audio as well. And we have hoped that you've been able to listen and engage to those audio samples before joining us today. But of course, they live here in this space for afterwards as well. So we encourage you to engage with our speakers that way. So a quick overview of our program. Day 1 is today. we've got just over 3 hours together, 4 different sessions in which we have our opening today with Siobha and Abby with our 2 opening keynotes. We then go into concurrent sessions, so 2 sessions run at the same time with think-ins that run for an hour. There's a think-in about learning with podcasts, and there's a think-in with accessing podcasts for research and thinking about that from new knowledge consumption and production. And then we can all come together for our following and our final thinking for today with a conversation about the power of listening with our hearts. So I just want to let you know, for those that are registered for all the events, the current Zoom link you're in is the Zoom link that will be for the keynotes now, the think-in for the learning session, and the think-in for in conversation. The only Zoom link that changes for today is that think-in for accessing research. Tomorrow, day 2 of our program, is a real exciting program that complements today, and we've got a practical base tomorrow. We have a beautiful keynote with my colleagues Inge Newburn and Jason Downs, where we'll be live recording a podcast episode for their podcast On the Reg, and then I'm going to dissect that with them, and we're going to talk about that whole planning process and how it is that they came to record what they did, what it looks like, and unpack that so we have a nice understanding of what it means to put scripts together and what it looks like. We're going to follow that with a practical workshop with Adobe Audition and looking at that power of storytelling, and we've got some wonderful interactive sessions there. And we've also got a tech talk as well at 4 o'clock. And we just want to check that everybody's on mute. At the moment, we can hear a couple of conversations going on behind the scenes there. Tomorrow, all those Zoom links are different as well, so making sure that you've registered for those that are relevant to you. So as I mentioned before, we are very much about creating our community, and our community today is created between presentations and also the chat, and they're running parallel. So utilising that chat to engage with each other, and we've got that opportunity to bounce off ideas and with each other. So if you haven't done so also, just introduce yourself now, tell us where you're from, what time zone it is, and allow that to happen and occur in the chat to say hello to each other that way. So I'm going to stop sharing now, and I have the absolute pleasure in introducing our very first keynote. And Siobha is joining us this morning. This afternoon, this morning for some people, afternoon for others. Siobha McHugh is an internationally recognised podcast producer, critic, researcher and teacher, and she is the founding editor of the Radio Doc Review, which was the first journal to develop critical analysis of podcasts and audio documentaries. She's partnered with leading Australian newspaper The Age to transform investigative journalism into hit podcasts, and many of these projects have won gold at the New York radio festivals, as well as many other awards. She is a producer. No. Making sure that we're on mute. Thanks. Lovely. Siobha is widely published, including an incredibly successful MOOC, The Power of Podcasting for Storytelling, that has had over 35,000 participants. Absolutely incredible, from over 150 countries. And shortly, she will be launching her new book, The Power of Podcasting, with New South Books in February 2022. And I had a little sneak preview of some aspects of it yesterday, and the proofs are on their way, so it's got to that very, very exciting stage. So Siobha is with us as an honorary associate professor in journalism at the University of Wollongong, and we welcome Siobha to our podcast conference as our opening keynote.
Thank you so much, Narelle. It's great to be here with my mad lockdown hair. I had hoped to be coming to you from in person, but of course that's gone out the window. So I'm just going to get my screen up, and then I will start the presentation proper. Okay. So yes, I'm coming to you instead from the sorry, this is, from the Narelle lands just south of Sydney and north of Wollongong, and I want to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And just a warning that this presentation may contain voices of Aboriginal people who have died. In the content, I'm going to tweak one of the conference questions and consider how do we connect with each other's minds and hearts through audio, because for me, it's a given that we do. And I look at what can podcasting offer in an academic context. And I'll do that in 3 parts. One, I'll be looking at the ways in which listening intersects with producing and consuming podcasts. 2, I'll be looking at exploring and understanding the audio medium, which of course is on what the platform on which podcasting is built. And I'll be looking at ways in which podcasting is intersecting usefully in different ways in the academy. So first, I just want to share a sneak preview from my book. I'm not really a visual person, perhaps understandably, but when I was trying to think of all the elements of podcasting for a readership that might come from places other than media comms and audio and all the other places, I kind of ridiculously came up with a Venn diagram. And here it is. And this is a non-tweet moment, please. I would rather this not be tweeted because we want to save it till the book proper. But essentially, this for me encapsulates the pillars of podcasting. So I've left out fairly self-evident things like the fact that it's portable and the method of consumption. But we know from research that most people listen to podcasts either to gain knowledge or to be entertained. And we also know that the host connection with listeners is really significant. And this is increasingly being studied by both scholars and industry, and is known to engender a sense of empathy with listeners. And the voice-driven medium that is podcasting confers a certain authenticity, which is much valued. Again, research shows that content obtained via podcast, people have more trust in than other forms of news media. Story is always crucial in engaging audience, and it's my particular interest, storytelling podcasts. But the 2 factors that are utterly interconnected and salient are the fact that everything comes through the audio medium, and that by bringing these factors into play, you can engender the much vaunted intimacy for which podcasting is renowned. So going on to listening, what also strikes me about podcasting is an awful lot of people who haven't made podcasts think it's just talk and that therefore it's very simple, simple as falling off a log. But in fact, as those of us who do it know, audio has its own grammar and logic, and that's what I really want to unpack here. And thinking about talk, well, let's not underestimate listening, because listening is in fact the corollary of talk. And one core building block of many podcasts is the interview. And in order to get that right, I think you have to do what I call aerobic listening, which is that kind of intense, focused listening, whereby you're exuding rapt attention to your interviewee so that they feel validated and want to continue and perform in a sense for you. And you're also mentally scanning what they're saying, thinking about how you might factor something into an upcoming question, or indeed detecting an error, whether accidental or deliberate. So listening aerobically is really important. And you know that when you hear the opposite, you hear the odd gormless interviewer who somebody says something fascinating, and instead of probing further, they are in autopilot mode and they go on to the next question on the list. And it's very irritating. So listening aerobically, I do advise. In the field, there's a whole different kind of listening, which might be new to many of you. So if you were asked to write an article for the conversation, I'm pretty sure you'd be thinking about images that you could associate with your article that would illuminate it. And it's the same working in an audio format. There are all kinds of sound elements that can just add texture and liveness to your podcast. And I would like people to start thinking through their ears in order to access that. So what do I mean by nonverbal? You can think about this either literally or laterally. So in preparation for this talk, I listened to lots of academic podcasts, and I came across one by some, it was on pediatrics, and they were interviewing a woman who had published a paper on infant vocalizations and how they could help you detect conditions like cerebral palsy. So it was a hugely important work, but she was in an audio format, and not once in that 40-minute episode did I hear a baby gurgle or cry. And it would have been just that she was literally talking about the range of vocalizations. It was crying out for baby sounds. And the point is that I would have had an emotional reaction to those sounds. And we know that emotional content is sticky. We retain it better. So she would have got her point across much more effectively had she used sound literally in that case. In a lateral sense, I suppose I mean just I collect good sound the way other people collect pictures. So whenever I'm wandering around the place, I'll whip out my iPhone and then I'll figure out how to draw on this archive in various ways. So let's say we're talking now about the pandemic and how we're all feeling locked down and miserable and wish that we could travel. So I would just drop in a bit of this.
We had your attention. Did the last call for Malaysia line MS751.
So this is just something I was going through Ho Chi Minh City, Saigon Airport, and this came on and immediately just reflex just went for the record button. And people kind of think that's weird, but I find it makes perfect sense. So try and build up a library of sound. And then finally, as a consumer, of course, you are absorbing the affective power of voice and sound as you listen. And I'll illustrate that with some clips. So here's something from Radiolab, an iconic podcast. This is an episode called Blame. And producer Bianca Yaver here was interviewing this man, Hector, about a very dark theme. He had managed to forgive the man who had brutally killed and raped his daughter. But the way that we meet Hector is like this.
My name is Hector Black. I'm 86, almost 86 and a half. When you get as old as I am, you add the halves again like you did when you were 3.
And that still brings a smile to my face, even though I've heard it many times. And it's important. It was a really good stroke to use that because it shows us that Hector is basically gentle and humorous and a likable man. And it makes us want to lean into what could be a very challenging story. So just all of that is conveyed in his tone of voice. Nothing has to be said, just his humor comes across and his tone. So let's get on to thinking about the audio medium per se. What are its characteristics? Well, the thing that I find most important to note about the audio medium is that, having a bit of a, here we go. It's temporal. It only exists in real time. You can't freeze frame audio. Why is that important? Well, it unspools in a linear manner. And therefore, timing is a crucial way of differentiating content, one bit of content from another. Because if you don't do that, all you've got really is oral, and I mean AURAL, oral toilet roll. You've got to differentiate your content. You've got to punctuate it. So we're familiar with the idea of punctuation. In a book, we think in broad terms, chapters and paragraphs, in micro terms, full stops and commas. And we can actually do the same with audio by putting audio space around, say, a section of speech. We actually do this naturally in conversation. We pause for effect and to let things sink in. You can actually have those kind of natural pauses, or you can underline a pause by using music to let a comment be absorbed, or you can use ambient sound as a bridge, maybe to take off to a new narrative direction. These are your creative choices, but the mantra is let it breathe. Don't butt things up so tightly together that there's no room to actually get the cognition factor happening. You need space in your audio. Also, audio is relational. So one sound layered with another or placed alongside will have a synergistic effect, will have a different effect than either of those sounds individually has. And this is something that, you know, we love. We call it the alchemy of the mix. And it's a kind of magical process that's part intuitive, part experience, where you put music, you change how people will perceive something and interpret something by the way in which you place and choreograph your sounds. And these are creative choices as well. And you can look at Radio Doc Review, which is online, to see analysis of these aesthetics of narrative. But mixing can also backfire. Music sets a mood and tees up expectation. And I've heard a lot of podcasts with these huge Game of Thrones-y type signature tunes, and then they segue straight to some mild-mannered bureaucrat. And I've been primed for World War III to be about to unfold. So, you know, don't let the music overwhelm your content. This isn't Hollywood. Audio and podcasting are conversational. So you have to write like you talk. And I find that most podcast hosts get this perfectly naturally when they're doing a chatcast. But if they go to write an intro and they're not perhaps used to scripting for oral conventions, they revert to formality, and it can sound very stilted. And actually that will undermine the whole intimacy factor that you're seeking. So learn to write like you talk. Just use contractions, use vernacular language. Say he's going, not he is going. Audio is immersive and cinematic because it makes you conjure the pictures in your mind. And so again, they stick more than perhaps video would, which is prescribed. And I'm going to show you this through an example using this podcast, Goodbye to All This, where Goodbye to All This is an acclaimed podcast by Australian radio producer Sophie Townsend, made for the BBC World Service. It's her beautifully written reflection 8 years on the untimely death of her husband, Russell, and the effect it has on her and their 2 young daughters. But the other standout element is production by Eleanor McDowell. And in this clip I'm going to play, and this is a slightly longer clip, it's about 1.5 minutes, I just want you to listen for certain things. I want you to listen to where and when music is introduced, and also, equally importantly, where it's removed. That's a really important effect and choice. Listen to the thrumming 3-second pause after Sophie gets terrible news from the oncologist. And then listen to the 14-second musical pause that amplifies that further. So Sophie deliberately sets out to write for the eye, and she does this in this clip by, she wants to let us know how claustrophobic the oncologist's office is, but instead of telling us that, she shows us in the best narrative tradition by drawing our inner eye to a little plastic Christmas tree that sits on the oncologist's desk. So here we go, change of mood.
As he goes to sit in his chair, the head of the department knocks into it, and it sways back and forth rather perilously before it rights itself. He moves it into the corner, out of the way. In the cancer centre, Christmas is embarrassing. We sit down, and he tells us what I think we already know. This is the end of the road. The chemo hasn't worked. The radiotherapy hasn't worked. Russell's not a genetic match for a trial of a drug that we thought might work. Russell will die. And after this is said, the appointment feels like a very polite breakup. cancer can't be stopped and we won't be seeing the oncologist again.
So a deeply affecting story that does what podcasting does best, which is personal storytelling. And, you know, this is your opportunity. It's very hard to get personal storytelling into journal articles, but podcasting is absolutely made for it. You can either do it at that high-end way of the crafted narrative that I've mentioned. And if you want to figure that out, I do recommend really going to Radio.Review to read the in-depth critiques. In fact, Sophie Townsend wrote one of them for us, because we have a board of top scholars and audio professionals. It's a really unique combination or coming together of industry and the academy, who nominate exemplars and then write in-depth critiques. It's all free and open access online. But I realize that's quite a daunting prospect if you are starting out in podcasting. So the other option is, even at a simpler level, just storify your interviews. Get people to tell things with a beginning, middle, and an end. Ask them to paint word pictures. And people who do this brilliantly are Richard Feidler in the Australian high-rating podcast Conversations, Michael Barbaro in the amazing The Daily, which is 4 million downloads per episode, and This American Life has been doing it for 25 years. So a little bit more on audio medium. People perhaps don't think so much about. Audio is spatial. It can deliver a sense of being up close or far off, not unlike the way a camera can take a shot from many angles, and that affects how we perceive content. So that makes things more three-dimensional. And in this tiny clip, I'm in Yuendamu, which is a remote Aboriginal community in Australia's central desert. And I'm there as part of an Australian Research Council project to investigate cross-cultural aspects of how the art is made. And I'm going to blend my interviews, my ambient sound, my music into a narrative podcast called Heart of Artness, which is online. This is just a raw field recording. I'm driving around the community with Flick Wright, a woman who managed the art centre there back in the 80s. She hasn't been back in decades, and she's having emotional reunions with Warlpiri women she recognizes and was once very close to. So just, she spots this woman and jumps out of the car, and just have a listen to how much energy is in this kind of spontaneous audio moment.
Hello, who are you?
Good.
Hey, what's your name?
Crazy Fleming.
Oh, no, no, no.
Nice to meet you.
Nick from long time ago.
So you don't have to speak Warlpiri to understand that there's warmth and emotion in that greeting. You can hear it in the tone. And this is the gold that audio can deliver. And that's why it's more than just talking. I really want to get that into people's heads to try and think through their ears and capture sound as well as speech.
Hello.
Whoops, sorry. Moving on.
You.
Whoops. Let's see. Oh, here we go. This is ironic because I'm just about to come up and tell you to do your tech right. Anyway, so we compose an audio format taking into account these qualities of pace, texture, voice, and mood. And engaging podcasts use emotion, sound, story, and orality. Most people we know listen one-on-one, often on headphones and earbuds. And all of these factors taken together are what bring out this intimacy quality. So just before I get on to the academic uses, a quick check-in with the tech. Don't be afraid of the tech side. It's really important because you actually squander half the intimacy of audio if your quality is poor or the voice is off mic and sounds like they're at the back of a barn rather than speaking right into your ear. Editing is your friend. Learn one of these programs, and I'm so glad you're doing some of this tomorrow, because most of us do sound better filleted or maybe even resequenced, and it's not that hard to learn. I've taught the basics in a few hours to people. Wear headphones when you're recording because that allows you to troubleshoot any issues that might come up, like wind noise or awful things that can cruel your recording. And I do recommend the NPR ear training guide for audio producers. But if all that does sound too daunting, then you have the option of collaborating. find your students, the journalism and media and music students who might be able to work with you on a project. If you're lucky enough to have a campus radio station, use that, as UTS does, University of Technology, Sydney, use the 2SER radio really well to produce the History Lab podcast. It's a win-win. Or hire a professional podcast producer, such as the graduates coming out from mine and other institutions who have now studied podcasting and are out there as guns for hire. Okay, so just getting on to section 3. I'm galloping through because I've got so a few more clips to play. So podcast studies is very much a thing. It exploded really after 2014, which was that Serial moment that most of you will know about, when the hit podcast Serial just broke the internet. And there's a fabulous website called podcaststudies.org where this is discussed from many perspectives. Please join us. It's led by Kim Fox at the American University in Cairo and Richard Berry in the UK. And both Mia Lindgren and I are on the steering committee. And there's a whole bunch of interesting young people doing PhDs. And there are networks and resources and even Zoom meetings. And there's a very useful literature review maintained by Nellie Heisey, which would be helpful for those of you from different disciplines who need to contextualize podcasting for perhaps articles you're writing. Those of us who are there use podcasts to convey research, to heighten engagement. So that's engagement with peers and the public. Others of us use podcasts to actually undertake research, such as our narrative podcast, Heart of Artness, and the AHRC in the UK also have accepted this, and I'm showing you an example next of that. And just to say that the same principles I've mentioned about how to harnessing audio strengths apply if you're making podcasts in the teaching and learning space. So try and use those when making podcast artifacts there too. Okay, so here's an interesting and creative podcast, Forest 404, which was a collaboration between 3 universities and the BBC. And it was a collaboration between a health economist, a cultural historian, an environmental psychologist, and an environmental historian to see how academic evidence might be woven into the creative process. And what they were actually doing was trying to measure how the sounds of nature affect our well-being. It happened pre-pandemic, but how important is that, as we now know? And so they came up with this idea of doing a sci-fi eco-thriller where this woman, Pan, who is living in some dystopian future where nature has been all but eliminated, and she's tasked with getting rid of or going through and deleting all the archives from the 20th century. So there's this great irony. She's going through all the wonderful speeches, Martin Luther King, Barack Obama, Neil Armstrong, and she's delete. And then she comes across something that stops her in her tracks. I hope you can hear this.
Was this music? Okay, our ancestors made some strange music, but this had a whole new kind of wrongitude. I got like a swimming feeling in my head from listening to it.
So she gets completely bowled over by these rainforest sounds of nature that she's never heard before. And it sends her on a quest to try and subvert the state and reclaim nature. So that's the premise of the podcast. And after each episode, it's very well produced. After each episode, they have a talk on the environmental humanities. And then they asked listeners to sign up for a survey, and they played them these different soundscapes. There's a beautiful one of frogs. I don't think I have time to go into it. They're on the website. And they asked people then to evaluate their response. And they got this enormous reply, very efficient reply capacity because of the heft of the BBC. And they ended up collecting the largest data set ever on natural sounds and well-being, which is the basis of this person's PhD. I contacted him and he told me that he's very close to publishing their results in journal articles. So it was a really well-conceived academic research project that put podcasting and audio at its core. very creative. A more popular, well-known one probably is the Happiness Lab by Professor Laurie Santos, who's this phenomenally successful podcaster from Yale University, professor of psychology. And this distills the expertise of hosts in an engaging manner and looks again at well-being. And I was a bit disconcerted, I have to say, to hear an episode recently where she opens by extolling the virtues of a certain laundry powder and telling us how soft her sheets are when she uses it, because even Laurie Santos, or perhaps especially Laurie Santos, is not exempt from having to exploit this parasocial relationship between host and listener in reading an ad. And presumably that goes to funding the production. She outsources the production to Pushkin, and they cite 10 people plus a co-writer and composer in the credits, even though it's quite lightly produced. 35 million downloads, and they were a finalist in an industry award. So it's obviously a very accessible product or artifact, a very good way of getting knowledge across. This is different again, Secret Feminist Agenda. It was a podcast by Hannah McGregor, a Canadian publishing academic, which looked at the ways we enact feminism in our daily lives. But what Hannah did differently was she decided to test whether the podcast could be seen as actual scholarship, not just knowledge mobilization. So her publisher commissioned not blind peer reviews, but public peer reviews from digital scholars, which can be viewed online, very brave. And they assess it at, in the same, using scholarly criteria. And my only criticism would be that they didn't apply a criterion of how well she used the audio medium to express, and that would compare to how in journal articles we evaluate language use, clarity of expression and flow. And I think you do have to factor that in if it's a podcast format. But undeterred, Hannah has gone on to form this Amplify pod network with interested colleagues, and you can find them on Twitter and a website, and they're trying to make peer-reviewed scholarship as easy to find as journal articles. History of Emotions, another brilliant podcast from London, which obviously audio is a great vector for emotional content. So this was made in heaven, a collaboration between scholars in history, philosophy and science, pairing with an audio producer to test how we experience anger and other emotions and think through their feelings and reflect on whether they're healthy emotions. And they came up with various types of content adapted for an audio format, ones that would work, including 2 dramas. Podcast used in teaching. I'd just like to recommend a couple of exemplars. Seen on Radio from Duke University in North Carolina is a remarkable podcast where host John Bewan just has a great ability to straddle the academic and scholarly and journalistic worlds and convert scholarly expertise into sound-rich, engaging story. His seasons have an uncanny knack of anticipating and illuminating the zeitgeist. And he's currently doing one on climate change that is brilliant. And he has been rightly acclaimed for his work, but he obviously helps by providing these learning aids as well. And more close to home, Gertie's Law from the Supreme Court in Melbourne. Basically, it has judges, barristers, and various other people talking about these key legal topics. Disclosure, I was a consulting producer on it. And it was an initiative of the court to make the court processes more transparent. And it uses story sound and beautiful theme music to make these engaging and accessible. And it worked so well that we won a gold award at the New York festivals in the education category. And in fact, it's right behind me there. And it's now been set as a text at various universities. So worth listening to get some ideas. And moving on, finally, this is the last bit, to my own podcast again, Heart of Artness. So this was conceived by art historian Professor Ian McLean, who wanted to investigate cross-cultural relationships in the production of Aboriginal art. And working with adjunct Professor Margot Neal, who was my co-host and advisor, she's head of Indigenous Knowledges at the National Museum of Australia. And so we worked I recorded 30 oral history interviews and then crafted them with lavish ambient sound, archive and music as narrative podcasts that would be accessible to an ordinary person. And it allowed us to go to the most amazing places. So here we are up in Northeast Arnhem Land in a place called Gangan in tropical North Australia. And I was welcomed there by these three Yolngu artists. So that's Goinbi Ganambar, Yinamala Gumana, and Garawan Wanambi. And we started off by talking about how this was the site of a terrible massacre. Now, first of all, when you hear the clip, you'll hear the birds and the silence and even a fly buzzing around, and it takes you straight to country, which of course is paramount for Aboriginal people. But also, I think it's really important to recognize that audio's non-intrusiveness is a huge bonus in that it allows you to discuss sensitive material more easily. It means you're not sticking a camera in somebody's face, you're not objectifying them, and you're not judging them on appearance. And I think that really was important. It was just me sitting down with a microphone, and with those two men, Garawan and Gonbi, they invited me to sit with them by the river, and they started just telling me how they made their art. So let's just have a listen to this little clip. It's only about 45 seconds, but listen to, they start speaking in their own language, in Yolngu Mata.
This is the place where the European or the Gangan Makesa.
Yinamala's great-grandfather arrived back from a trip and stumbled on the victims.
When he got there and he see all the people, lying down, and he only recognized the armbands. And then he knew that these people was killed.
And their body, their bones, their flesh, going down the river.
My uncles, my fathers, they decided to put the plaque.
Could you read it for us, Yinamala?
In memory of the Broadway people, the Gangan Makesa.
So how am I doing for time, Narelle? I've got about 2 minutes to go. Am I right?
You're slightly over time, so
okay, I'll wrap here then. I won't play this.
Awesome.
Okay, so we contend that this podcast creates new knowledge because, as Ian said, everyone has an idea of what Indigenous art is, but they rarely talk to an Indigenous artist, remarkable as that sounds, to find out what it is. And this oral history archive is in itself a scholarly research resource. And Indigenous knowledge is being included not only literally via their own voice, but then the podcast qualitatively changes how the Western public thinks, which alters the paradigm of how Aboriginal art is viewed, and crucially has an economic impact as well. So it basically extended conventional art history methodology as well in an inclusive and collaborative way, and develops respectful cross-cultural relationships. So all of those things, and it was a podcast. So I will end here. I won't play you that clip. There's a bibliography that you can check out on YouTube. And I will just end with a shameful plug for my book. Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing, sorry.
Thank you so much, Siobhan. I can do the strange kind of single clapping on behalf of all of us. That was just fabulous. Lots of resources, of course, for people to pick up. But especially, I think the ability to hear your examples is, of course, what makes it so special. And it's something that we wanted to highlight with this conference, to make sure that all the presentations have audio examples, because we do still find conversations about podcasting or radio, for that matter, without any audio being played. And I think it's an integral part of what we're talking about. So I did want to just note, for those of you who might not have seen on Siobhan's over one of her shoulders, so that's one of the awards, for one of the many awards that she's won in the New York Festival in the Radio Awards. And it's just fabulous to be able to share that with you. And I look forward to reading your book.
Thank you.
So with that, we move to our next keynote. We are so grateful to have the two of you speak today, and I'm particularly grateful to Abby Ryan Guido, who is staying up. It must now be about, is it 1:30 in the morning potentially?
It is 1:45.
1:45. So Abby is a US-based communication designer, educator, and podcast host whose research examines the process of implementing graphic design principles through a human-centered design approach. So this is really interesting, talking about design in an audio form. The podcast is called Design Together. And Abby runs a design studio where she does her research, looks at branding, publishing, user experience, and user interface design. And some of your clients include the American Translator Association and also University of Pennsylvania. And I gather that's where you are at the moment.
I am at Temple University. So.
Sorry, that is my mistake.
No worries at all.
Thank you very much, and we will hand over to you.
Great. All right. Let me get my screen going. Everyone can see it okay? Awesome. All right. Thank you so much for having me. That first presentation was amazing. I feel like very energized. I'm about to go into my third season, so I'm going to be taking a lot of what we heard today into that. As Mia shared, I have a podcast called Design Together. My podcast began out of need because of the pandemic. I had proposed some research over the summer of the first year where I was hoping to spend some time observing design collaboration in different design firms throughout, for me, first in Philadelphia, later on during a sabbatical, was going to expand all over the United States. And I decided pretty quickly when everything went virtual that spending a week watching other Zoom meetings was not the best way to use my time. And there was born the podcast. So the idea behind Design Together is to take a look at how folks in the design industry collaborate. Part of that is to bring some of those lessons into the classroom. And it also is a way, and you'll see later on, how it connects a lot of the research that I do. I think it's important and to share what team it does take to make this happen. Being myself teaching full-time and having a business, I do use a lot of help. I had a friend work on my music. I have interns that help with a lot of the design production. The design of the show and all the promotional material is very important. So I do have a lot of help with that. I've been using Descript for some transcribing of the podcast. I've had multiple producers that help. I did do a little bit of it myself at first and quickly realized that it was worth my time and money to hire an expert. I'm currently using Libsyn and I have gotten some support from my university for some of this research. So I want to talk today about how might we as educational podcasters work together to educate our colleagues on the merit of podcasting. This is something that I've been doing myself, and I know a lot of what I refer to today will be in the US higher education system, but I think a lot of it is equivalent. But a lot of what I've been doing this past year is really working to educate those around me of how to talk about podcasting in relationship to research, and in a way to help myself as I'm moving up to the tenure process, and also to help colleagues that I've gotten to know that are also using podcasts as research. So I've broken up this talk today into 4 lessons: building connections, shameless self-promotion, publish, and also make it count. So we're going to first start with building connections. So as I began my podcast, the first thing I did, and I'm sure some of you as well who've entered this realm have done this, is I reached out to the folks that I knew from my social network, from business, from people I've met on LinkedIn, and just reached out and asked them to connect and share how it was going for them. I always tell my students this, and I like to share, I think people want to help each other, and that sometimes all it takes is just reaching out and saying, hey, can I grab your ear for 30 minutes and ask you some questions? And usually people say yes. People are very generous with their time. More than that, though, was also asking to be a guest. So while making these connections, I also realized the importance to spread around what I'm doing, that I would be able to go on other folks' shows who have built-in audiences and have been around for a while and talk about what I'm doing, talk about what their show is focused on. And a lot of times it really is just reaching out and asking. In fact, on The Future, which was, I don't know how many of you know Chris Do, but in the States, he has over 500,000 followers on YouTube. He's a pretty big name in design. And it was kind of like throwing my name in and saying, well, what could he, worst thing he could say is no. So I sent him a message, said, I love your show. I'd love to be a guest. And I was able to be a guest in his show, and just doing that and then seeing how my downloads increased was really motivation to continue doing that. And building your community. It takes a lot to organize all of the different ways that you can promote your podcast, but also build the community to have conversations around your shows. And it takes time, but it's worth it. And I'm showing here, I have my Instagram, I have a Facebook, I have LinkedIn, and I make sure that whenever a new show is coming out, whenever I'm starting to plan a new season, talking about guests, I'm always sharing what I'm doing on all of my platforms and engaging with the audience as they communicate with me through those platforms. Presenting at conferences. I was fortunate to present at an Adobe Education Leaders Conference about the what, why, and hows of podcasting as an academic. And this presentation was specifically about podcasting. And so it was very easy to talk about what I was doing. On the other hand, I was a presenter for Adobe Max last year, and I was talking about 3D package design. So while there is a connection to my research, it wasn't about the podcast, but I made sure to get that into the bio as well. So the more folks I get to talk to, the more folks I meet, the more people who I can possibly share what I'm doing with. And with that, my conference tip is that when we do get back to all being together, and I would love to be there right now, is that everyone I meet during the day, I go back to my hotel room and I connect with them on LinkedIn right away. I just say, it's great to meet you for a second. I just wanted to connect on here. And I find just making that quick, simple connection really helps to build your network. So this is a quick little summary of making connections. You reach out to all the podcasters you now know me. I'd love to help anyone who wants to reach out to me. It never hurts to ask. Building your community. Present at conferences, and again, always make sure that you get that into your bio and how folks can find what you're working on. And then comes the shameless self-promotion. So being a designer, this is really important to me. And the design of my podcast is actually part of what I publish, and I'll be sharing that in a moment. But I do spend a lot of time designing and promoting. What you're looking at here are some posters that I created for last season. I have all the covers of all of my guests that came, and then some key quotes from different episodes. And a lot of this is just to have visual collateral to use on my website, to use on the social media networks, and to build the brand around what Design Together is. So that when folks start seeing these color palettes, seeing the way images are treated, seeing the typography, they're drawn in and they're interested in what the show is. Strategically planning your guest lineup. So when I sat down to plan the second season, this is the covers you're seeing from the episodes from the second season. I made sure to think about everyone I was having, who their networks are. So often I'm looking for folks that I know are in the design world, but maybe geographically located somewhere different than I am. I do love bringing in folks that I have relationships with just for the part of storytelling and how the interviews go when you have that personal relationship. So I like to mix some of them in. I mixed in some talking to a few people about collaboration together, and that was really powerful, and in fact has inspired what I'll be doing this next coming up season. And then promote it. I make sure to tell folks when it's coming out. I always make sure to share key quotes from the episodes. Just little kind of listen, share, subscribe, getting people to get excited. I share my celebrations. I'm not getting millions of downloads, but when I got to 2000, it was a moment I wanted to celebrate and share. So I made a visual so that I could share them out. And share it with everyone. So I teach at Tyler School of Art and Architecture, which is part of Temple University. And I know how important it is to be our best advocates and our best promoters. So I make sure that I reach out and tell my communications team at my university, this is what I'm working on, in hopes that they too will share that out. And that's what you're taking a look at here. And so the summary for the Shameless self-promotion is consistent branding. It has a lot of power. Being from a design background, being a design podcast especially, it's so important that everything is consistent and it's very obvious that everything works together. Invite guests who attract new audiences and also are great promoters. So I love to find people who are like me and love to share what they're working on. And I know that's going to help them share what we did together as well. Using social media to share your show and just getting out the word. Talking to whoever you can, meeting all the folks you can. I connected with Narelle and Mia through folks at Adobe that I reached out to that knew I was working on this, and that's how I ended up here today. So getting the word out is so important to make sure that you're not creating this amazing work in a bubble. And then publish any way you can. So for me, in design and in my tenure guidelines is that I can publish design work that gets into international design competitions. And so Graphice is a big competition. So one of the reasons why I do spend so much time on the visuals for the show is so that I can use that material for getting the branding published in these design competitions. And I recently was awarded an honorable mention in Graphice. I'm just starting to push this material out. So I anticipate to kind of grow that side of the publishing for the podcast, which will be really helpful. And again, there are a ton of podcast competitions out there. The Communicator Awards are design awards that I apply to every year with design research. And they also have a podcast category now. So I was able to put that in. And it's really important whether it's, you know, a huge name or a smaller competition that I build these, because that adds to my CV and allows me to talk more about the podcast, because now it has been recognized by a, you know, award system. And I think everyone can find this unique angle for publishing. You know, for me, it is the design of the actual branding, but I think we can all be creative with how we view our podcast and how we can think about how to create something that we will be able to share and get recognition for. And I think, you know, the more competitions you can enter, the better. Small, big, whatever it might be. The more recognition you can get, the more listeners you're going to have, the more downloads, and the more impact you can have. And then making it count. So I put together this chart today. I got really excited actually, because what happened a bit organically also has been slowly molded to be the centerpiece of all of my research. So part of my professional research is professional practice, is working with clients and producing design communications for them. I do some industry expert adjunct research, so talking about how can universities connect to the industry by having industry expert adjuncts teach and bridging that gap between university and industry. Design leadership, I have my MBA, and so the connection between design and business is very, very important for what I look at. Connecting academia to industry, collaborative design processes. So design in general has changed along with many other professions, where we now realize the importance of these 21st century skills and how we work together and how we communicate and how we connect. And a lot of that was not being used in the design classroom. And so I focused a lot on how can we bring these practices into the classroom. And then the final is design publication. So that was what I shared, where I was talking about my work that I produce for the branding for the show and how I get that published. And the Design Together podcast bridges this all together. It takes this, strong branding. It takes the looking at how do we talk to industry. Most of my guests I do talk to are folks in the design industry, and I'm talking about how they're working together on whether it be a specific project, maybe it's designers and strategists. I do also talk with some folks in academia to hear how they're currently bringing collaboration into their classroom. And so this show is bridging everything together, and it makes for a really wonderful story when I get to share how my research is all connected. It became this missing link for me in my own story, working towards tenure. Something I'm working on now is how can I use the content of the interviews I'm recording for research. I've worked with my IRB, and I know that it's a different body there, but they are the folks in the States to work through to get permission for human subject research. And I had some really humorous conversations with them talking about the folks I'm interviewing are not anonymous. And so if I'm using what they're sharing in any type of published research, their identity will be exposed. And how can I work around that? And we work together on a consent form. And I've been studying coding qualitative interviews and looking for the themes that run throughout the interviews in the show so that I can use that for some other types of publishing, writing about the content that I'm gathering. And so this is something I'm really interested in doing. It's time intensive, and it's hard to kind of juggle everything, but it definitely is a road to explore that I'm excited to be kind of traversing right now. One sec. I got really fortunate last fall because my program head was on a sabbatical and I was asked to be the interim. And part of this role was working with the chair of the department on our actual tenure track guidelines. And so I was able to be the best advocate for myself and get it into the guidelines. And I wanted to share this, and it wasn't, everyone was very supportive. And I'm sure even if I wasn't in that role, they're very supportive and were looking out for me as well. But I think that by working to get this into my guidelines, I can hopefully share this with others who then can bring it back to their own universities and share, hey, this Research One university is including that producing intellectual design podcast is part of what will work towards their scholarship for tenure. And so this is really important to me that this is there now and that I can share this with whoever else would be interested. And we spoke a lot about the wording and what the value was, but in the end, it did make it through. So that was a big win. And then applying for a sabbatical. So I was able, in our system, we are able to apply for a sabbatical while we're in a tenure track position. And so I was able to apply for a sabbatical that I took last spring to focus on the production of season 2 of the podcast. It was such a wonderful thing to be given that time to focus. I'm realizing now as I'm back to teaching, the balancing act is tough. And just the energy and what it takes. And I just related so much to hearing, about how folks listen to it and think this is just as easy as hitting record and starting a conversation and don't really understand what goes in to just producing one episode. And I don't think my sound quality or anything I add is to the level of any of these wonderful podcasts, but I'm proud of what I'm doing. And having all that time was just so great to do it, and figuring out now how to make it happen and to continue to happen is a challenge, but something that I'm taking on. And then showing the numbers. So again, I'm not getting millions of downloads, but I'm able to find research that shows what percentage of downloads put me in the top 50%. And I think all of this is to be celebrated. And so I'm really excited to celebrate this in my research writing and talk about the impact that my show is having, and just aim to continue to grow it and grow that audience. So with that, summarizing my lesson 4, use your podcast to bring together your research. I love making charts and figuring out how everything kind of works it and getting those aha moments of like, yes, this connected it all. That was just such a great reveal for me. I'm working with your IRB or equivalent to help educate folks on why podcasts should be considered research. I was really excited that I was the first person at my university to even talk to the office about how can I use this in research, and at least begin that conversation. Ask if it can be added to your promotion and tenure guidelines. Use your sabbatical. And I think a lot of these things, the more that we all do this together, the more common it'll become, and it won't be such an odd ask. I can share that I did get a little bit of pushback about what is the value of this research. One, because of its connection to pedagogy and teaching, and that was one of the goals, was to help bridge that gap. But also as a designer, how is a podcast of value? And luckily there are some great examples out there that I was able to pull and show and share. But again, the more we do it, the more common this is going to get, and the more folks that will also benefit from what we do in front. And show statistics. And finally, and I'm really going to sped through this a little bit. I'm sorry, my time is a little off right now, being in the middle of the night. But I am starting season 3. I'm really excited about some updates of the branding. I'm looking at my show as a chance again every season to reinvent the visuals of the show. And so I've grown what I've done in the past 2 seasons to this new look. And as I shared, I'm having a lot of fun having conversations with multiple people. I'm finding that energy, and being about design collaboration, it just makes a lot of sense. Again, that was one of those things where I was like, oh, I wonder why I'm enjoying the conversations the most when there's multiple stakeholders. Like, well, it's about collaboration. This makes sense. So this season, I'm focusing all on talking to pairs or 3 folks at a time about how they work together. Right here is a colleague of mine who is working on rebranding the athletics department of our university with an alumni and a class, and hearing about how that process worked is really exciting. So that is coming soon in this November. And then finally, I would love to connect. Please reach out to me. I'd love to get to know some of you. My email address is here. Take a listen to the show. Keep an eye out for the new season. Follow me on all the social media networks, and just thank you again for having me. And hopefully I give everyone a little bit of maybe a coffee break or a bathroom break before we move on. So.
Thank you, Abby. Absolutely delighted to have you as a part of our opening keynote with Siobha as well. And what has been so exciting between your two presentations is that they're both so different that complement each other as well, and really gives us a holistic view of what we can do with podcasting, the power of podcasting, how we can think about it in as educators, for education, for learning and teaching, as research as well. So thank you so much. And we're very appreciative that it's past 1 a.m. now for you. And we just love that you have been able to join us and be with us. So thank you so much. And we hope you sleep well tonight when you get there.
Yeah, my students are going to be in for it at 8 in the morning when I'm up in 6 hours. So thank you all.
That's beautiful. We've actually got a couple of minutes up our sleeve. So I think maybe we can open the floor up if there's any questions. Mia, Claire, if you've seen any questions in the chat room that perhaps we want to open up to Abby and Siobha while we've got both our keynotes here.
There's some really great questions and comments and links and things in the chat, so thank you for that. I think one point that Abby really noted, and I know that Siobhan has also had to consider, is the question of ethics. And I appreciate this is quite a big issue, but maybe just hearing from both of you at least briefly about what we can do to educate ethics committees. Siobhan, do you want to start? Yes.
Sorry. Yes, it was very interesting. Obviously, doing the Heart of Artness, which had Indigenous participants, and dealing with the ethics committee there, and trying to have them understand, like they almost were trying to put obstacles in our way, and we had to point out to them that, you know, it would further marginalized voices if we didn't give these people the opportunity to choose whether they wanted to speak to us or not. But there was a lot of pushback that, you know, even though this was a cross-cultural project, which by its nature had to have both an Indigenous and a non-Indigenous person interviewing Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people, it was, you know, so there was not a problem with having me as a non-Indigenous person doing the interviewing. That was actually, Margot thought it was an asset, you know, but there was still a lot of, I felt it was a lot of just knee-jerk reaction, just to close it down. It's easier to close it down and say no than to actually explore the complexities. But it took a long time. Obviously, we had a lot of consultation with elders, and we took on cultural protocols. We took everything very seriously. We allowed the artists to sign off, of course, before we published anything. And in the end, we got through, and the reaction has been great. Not just in the remote communities. I know Richard Bell, an Indigenous artist, really likes the podcast I did with him, which was quite feisty, and he has it up on his website of his gallerist. So I think this is a great opportunity to let more marginalized voices be heard, and just take the time to develop a strong application when you put it in, and explain the context and draw on the literature that we now have about podcasting to show that it's grounded in scholarship.
Thank you. Abby, do you want to say something more just to contextualize as well from your perspective?
I mean, I think for me, it was about starting those conversations, and actually the surprise that I had that I was the first to do so. And that would just be my kind of, you know, ask of everyone is to begin those conversations with your own review boards, and figure out how we can all work together to make sure we can use what we're collecting in a way. It was the publishing who they are. And once we got around to agreeing that as long as the interviewee agrees that their likeness will be figured out by someone who's reading about it, it seemed to be enough for them to say, okay, you know, you won't use names, but they do understand. And that's what the wording is in my consent form, that you know, it will be easy to tell from anything I published who said what. And I was pretty excited that was an agreement made. So I'm losing my words, I can say that. I'm seeing them disappear.
Thank you so much. And maybe if I can come back to you, Siobhan, just to follow up, because I know you've thought a lot about this, the difference between something that's written out on a page versus something that's spoken. Is that one of the reasons, because ethics committees and perhaps other kind of funding bodies and the academic environment is less used to working with voices and therefore don't quite know how to assess it?
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, oral history scholars have been dealing with this for over 50 years. It's quite entrenched in the United States, oral history use of audio. And Sandro Portelli, who's my favorite oral historian, he's an Italian academic, he said famously, audio is the text. In oral history, audio is the text. And for a long time, I used to not provide a transcript deliberately, because I thought it would drive people to the audio and make them listen. And I didn't want people just mining a transcript for content rather than having the experience of engaging effectively with the speaker. But I've actually changed my mind on this, Mia, recently, and I'm about to put up transcripts of all the episodes of Heart of Artness, partly because it will help people. I realize myself now, having written a whole lot of analysis of various podcasts, it's awfully time consuming going through real-time audio, trying to find a quote that you can, cite. And so it helps academics, but also it's, I think when there are cultural differences, whether it be, people not speaking English as a first language, it can be hard to get things first time around. And a carefully done transcript that is correct, and be very careful that I've even detected errors on some very well-known transcripts, like in S-Town, John B. McLemore says, somebody says to him, telling him this awful news, John B. killed himself last night, and they have it in the transcript as himself. Because, and I'm not blaming people for that, but what I'm saying is that whoever's doing the transcribing, and maybe it was AI, they automatically go for himself. So be very careful to go by the ear. It's back to thinking through your ears. And I mean, they do enjoin us on that website to go off the audio, not off the transcript, that it's only supposed to be a guide. So yeah, just remember that mantra, perhaps. Audio is the text, but a carefully done transcript will aid and abet the appreciation of the audio.
That's a wonderful a wonderful note to end on. Narelle.
Thank you. Thank you, Siobhan. Thank you, Mia. Thank you, Abby, once again.